What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Today we'll be talking about augmented feedback. Let's get it popping. So we've talked about feedback previously in other units there, and specifically those in closed loop processes, meaning that we're trying to detect errors, and if there's an error there, we make a correction there. But we want to now expand our discussion of different feedback classifications. Okay? There's essentially two main categories of feedback. There's inherent feedback, feedback from the senses, sight, touch, taste, feel. Okay? And again, that's mainly what we've discussed about in previous units. However, in this unit here, we're going to mainly talk about augmented feedback. Okay? And this is information provided about the action that we undergo that is supplemental to inherent feedback. So along with the information from the senses, we get other types of feedback there that can help us with performance. And this augmented feedback can either occur during or after the movement. And here are essentially opposite types of augmented feedback. So on the left side, you got one type of feedback, and on the right side there is the opposite type of feedback. So let's start off here. Concurrent feedback means it's happening while the movement is actually occurring, whereas terminal feedback occurs once the movement has finished. Immediate means that immediately after the action has occurred, the feedback is given right away, versus delayed here is that there's some period of time from the movement ending and when you give the feedback, whether it's a few seconds, a few minutes, a few hours, and maybe even days. Then we got verbal and nonverbal feedback there, which makes sense. Verbal means that you hear things in a spoken format versus nonverbal, non-speaking feedback. Accumulated feedback means as you take all the past results there and accumulate or bring them all together there, kind of like a summary maybe. Okay? Versus distinct feedback there is giving feedback that looks at each performance trial there separately. And then finally, we have knowledge of results versus knowledge of performance. And these mean similar things, but knowledge of results is that we get information about the outcome of the particular movement. Versus knowledge of performance, we get information about the nature of the movement itself. And we'll talk a little bit more detail what these are in future slides. So for the rest of this PowerPoint here, feedback will just refer to augmented feedback unless otherwise specified there. First, let's talk about concurrent feedback. Here's an example of this. Let's say we've got someone who's running. And while they're running, we tell them, make sure you have high knees. So telling them they need to run with high knees there as they are running is an example of concurrent feedback. Usually, concurrent feedback will be used with continuous tasks there. Okay? So things that happen over and over again, like running, like swimming, like biking, those are typically times when we would use concurrent feedback. With discrete tasks, typically they are too fast and in nature there to oftentimes use concurrent feedback with. Oftentimes concurrent feedback, we have some sort of visual feedback given, maybe auditory or haptic, meaning touch feedback. Again, on the opposite side of concurrent feedback is terminal feedback. An example of this here is, let's say a pitcher pitches the ball. And after the pitcher pitches the ball there, the coach says, hey, focus on snapping your wrist on your next pitch. So that cue of being told to snap his wrist after the pitch is completed, that's an example of terminal feedback. Now, terminal feedback is one of the most common types of augmented feedback that we see. And with terminal feedback, there are two important categories that we can get from terminal feedback. Knowledge of results, which will be abbreviated by KR in this PowerPoint set, as well as knowledge of performance, abbreviated by KP. First, focusing on knowledge of results there. Okay, this is terminal feedback given about the movement there in terms of the specific environmental goal. Here's one example that's very specific. Let's say knowledge of results feedback was given would be that your throw was 3 feet past the target. So knowledge of results there is very specific to what the outcome was. Another example of knowledge results there, but this is more general in nature, would be good job. So someone kicks a ball and the coach tells them good job. That would be knowledge of results because the kick that they underwent was very good. So again, point to note here, knowledge of results is about the movement outcome in terms of the environmental goal and not how the movement was actually achieved itself. That would be knowledge of performance. And we'll take a look at that in one of these upcoming slides. Now, important thing to note here, knowledge results has been shown to both enhance performance in acquisition as well as enhanced retention, meaning that if you give knowledge results there as you're first learning a movement, during that actual practice session where you're learning the movement there, performance in that particular task will be enhanced while you're learning it. And then after a delay or something along those lines where let's say we wait a couple days and practice again, we will have better retention of that actual skill there due to knowledge of results. And finally there with knowledge of results there, some information related to goal achievement must be received through inherent or augmented feedback for learning to occur. So again, kind of similar to knowledge of results there, but different there is knowledge of performance. Okay? And this is where feedback is given about the movement pattern itself. Okay? And mainly it focuses on information on kinematics. So one example of knowledge of performance would be that your backswing was too short. Okay? So not looking at the result there, like the previous example showed where it said your throw was 3 feet past the target. This focuses on the actual movement itself and what's happening during that movement. So again, if I'm swinging a golf club, your backswing was too short. Here's an important point to note there. Knowledge of performance does not necessarily inform the learner about the success in terms of meeting the environmental goal. So for example, when that golfer was undergoing his backswing, the backswing might have been too short, but how did that relate to how close the ball got to the hole? Did the ball get 2 feet from the hole? Was it 5 feet? Was it 10 feet? Was it a couple of inches away from the hole? So knowledge of performance does not give information about the environment in terms of the environmental goal. Now, with this here, knowledge of performance is probably one of the more common types of feedback given from instructors and coaches. But since we don't have the knowledge of the results there with knowledge of performance, it might not always be a better choice to use. Another way to look at knowledge of performance versus knowledge of results there is knowledge of results deals more with the external information, while knowledge of performance deals with more internal information. Or other ways you could look at this as knowledge of results focuses more on external focus, while knowledge of performance deals with more internal focus. So one important background information might give us some more information about feedback there is the law of effect. And Thorndike, in a study in 1927, mainly focused on research looking at animals and training those animals. Okay? And what he noted there with his studies there is that there's association between feedback and the strengthening of behaviors there. Okay? So what feedback does is helps the learner, okay, in his case was animals, but us as coaches there, looking at our athletes there, helping them problem solve, okay, the process of detecting when errors are occurring and correcting those errors, okay, when learning some sort of skilled movement or pattern. Now, in his studies there, he made an assumption which seems logical that the more feedback or information we get would equal more learning. However, through more recent studies, okay, we will see in this PowerPoint slide set, this is almost certainly incorrect. So more feedback or more information is not necessarily better in terms of learning. Okay. What we need to focus on is this feedback given? How is it being presented? Okay. When do we present it? The schedule of the presentation. Okay. And how often we give our feedback there are more important variables in determining how much learning undergoes. And the next several slides we'll look at what kind of feedback is given, how it's given, and when it's given. So here are four main parts of augmented feedback, okay, and functions of this feedback. What is it supposed to do? Okay. So first, augmented feedback there should provide information about the errors that we are trying to correct. Number two there, augmented feedback should either motivate the learner to do something or discourage the learner from doing a particular movement or task there that will be detrimental. Augmented feedback helps the learner focus on particular things. And finally, augmented feedback there, depending on how it's used there, can create a dependency, okay, possibly leading to problems later on, meaning that the learner relies too much on the feedback, which could blunt the learning response in the long run. So first, let's talk about the precision of feedback, or how specific it is. Okay. For example, there, you missed the bullseye by 3 inches. That could be one example of precision of feedback, because 3 inches tells us how close the dart thrower was to hitting the bullseye. So essentially, precision of feedback means the level of accuracy in which the feedback describes the particular movement or outcome. Okay. And this is mainly valuable when we're trying to quantify feedback, meaning that we're assigning a specific value or number there to our feedback. With this here, how precise we need to be on our feedback is important depending on the skill level and possibly age of our athletes or the people that we are trying to teach. With novices, oftentimes our errors are so big that the exact size doesn't matter there. So talking about that you missed the bullseye by 3 inches in beginners there is probably not going to be very valuable. And not only do these beginners there have a tough time essentially understanding how precise they need to be, beginners also have a tough time making precise adjustments there to their particular skill. However, as they become more advanced in nature there, so expertly skilled athletes or performers there, more precision will be effective. So us as coaches or teachers there, it's important that we be precise, but we don't want to overload our athletes or our students there with too much information. Because too much information overloads our attentional capacity there and possibly help or causes us to focus more internally, leading to a detriment in performance. So what we should do is start with focusing on the most important fundamental error and then move from there. Another type of augmented feedback is video feedback. And video feedback is very valuable because we can give very clear information and very precise information specifically about the knowledge of performance. Now, video feedback by itself might not always be useful for learning there. Okay? And that's because if you're watching a video there are tons of different things to focus on in that particular information or in that video. So there might be too much information given at once, leading to some sort of confusion. So how we can account for this is if we are trying to teach our athletes or students, what we can do is focus on a few different things there, giving specific cues on what we want our learners to watch and learn from. So in this particular study here to the right there, on the left axis there is we got a subjective form rating, meaning that the higher the number, the better they are, the better that they are learning there, okay, and the better that they're performing. In the test session there, again, this is looking at number of trials, okay? And what you can tell from this key here and these lines here is that if you got videos with some sort of cues or feedback, looking at the red and the green line, you performed better and learned faster than if you were just given feedback about just watching the video, or if you were just given knowledge results there without any sort of video feedback. And specifically, along with the videos and cues there, if you're giving cues about what to fix or what to correct there, that tended to be better than just giving feedback with cues on what to focus on. Guidance is another term of feedback, and this is oftentimes a technique used in rehab where the learner is physically assisted through the particular task that they are trying to learn. Okay? Meaning it could be that you are, with guidance feedback, you are actually physically pulled and pushed through a particular movement sequence. So if you've seen a coach with a young athlete, they're moving their particular arm through a specific throwing motion to try to teach them how to throw a baseball there. That could be an example of guidance feedback. And with guidance feedback, another important aspect of it is that it prevents incorrect movement by physically limiting them on the particular apparatus that they're using. Okay. Guidance feedback could also be used by someone verbally talking someone through a new situation. So maybe first you'll go here, next you go here, and then you'll finish here. So that would be an example of guidance feedback. And because the apparatus that they're using limits errors there, okay, because they're physically pushed and pulled through a movement, and because they're following the directions from someone there, talking them through the movement, the goal of guidance feedback is to prevent errors in the particular task that they are undergoing. Okay. And because of this here, we are preventing errors while they are going through the task there. We would expect to see that performance while they are learning it in the actual practice session, those skills will be enhanced during the session, but will it actually enhance learning? Will we actually see a retention in performance through some sort of delay and then retesting that particular skill? Okay. We'll talk about guidance a little bit later on in this particular PowerPoint set, but I want you to keep this question in mind here when we get to it later on. All right, looking at knowledge of performance versus knowledge of results there. Is one a better form of augmented feedback compared to the other? With knowledge of performance, it provides a more precise information how to change a particular movement pattern. Okay. With that there, okay, we can provide more information, precise information, but it also could provide too much information, may leading to information overload there. Okay. And with knowledge of performance, it might require an expert there to cue specific information. Okay. Knowledge of performance there may also lead to an internal focus of attention. Okay. And finally, it might hurt the athlete's problem-solving skills because it is so specific and precise, and mainly due to that information overload part. Knowledge of results may provide the right amount of information, not too much, not too little, but just right there to engage in the athlete or the student there in a problem-solving process. With knowledge of results there, uses feedback there to assist the learning process rather than guiding it. Versus knowledge of performance is more so guiding it. Okay, knowledge of performance is guiding it. Knowledge of results, okay, assists in the learning process but doesn't guide it. Okay. So with knowledge of results, one thing I would star there in your notes there is that it may not show results in practice or acquisition of performance, but it will demonstrate learning on retention and transfer. Meaning, in simple terms, when we're first learning the skill in the actual practice session, knowledge of results there will probably show less skilled actions. Meaning, for example, if I'm learning how to shoot a free throw and one person's getting knowledge of performance, the other is getting knowledge of results there, knowledge of results there will be less successful during the initial learning process. However, okay, given a delay there, and we see if we've retained the free throw shooting skill, or we transfer that free throw shooting skill to shooting other forms of shots there, the knowledge of results group will be better than knowledge of performance. Knowledge of results and optimal value there. Okay. So again, as we talked previously, knowledge of results has optimal informational value, and specifically there when the learner is uncertain about the reliability of the sources of information. So where the learner or where the athlete is getting their information, if the student or athlete is unsure about how reliable that person or source can be there, okay, that can be important there. Here's a dictionary analogy. Okay, the dictionary, okay, that you've got there, we have it available there. Okay, it's very objective and very reliable. Okay, we use the dictionary to check on the spelling of our words there when we're not sure if we know how to spell that particular word. Okay, however, if we're sure of how to spell it there, okay, or we're pretty confident in spelling it, we wouldn't use the dictionary. So the dictionary would be a reliable source of information. So therefore, augmented feedback is optimally useful when the learner asks for it. So make a star or note right here. If your student or if your athlete there asks for feedback there, that feedback is going to be more valuable compared to the student or athlete who does not ask for that feedback. Now let's look at feedback in terms of how often it is given. Okay, do we give it after every trial, or we look at it only after some trials? Okay, and so with this here, the frequency we kind of got two different categories. Okay, absolute frequency. My apologies. There is the total number of feedback presented, okay, versus relative frequency looks at the percentage of trials receiving that particular feedback. So here's an example. Okay, let's say you have 70 trials and you're given feedback on 35 of them. Okay, so the absolute frequency of feedback given would be 35, because 35 times the athlete was given feedback. Now, if you look at relative frequency, would mean that on 50% of the trials there, the athlete was given feedback, because on 35 of the 70 trials, they were given feedback. The trials that a particular athlete or student undergoes without feedback being given are called blank trials. And one question we should keep in mind as we go through some more slides there is that, do blank trials where no feedback is given, okay, do they have any function in learning? Meaning, are they helpful in the learning process, or are they just a waste of time? Okay. We might expect that more augmented feedback we're given, the better for both performance and learning, okay, especially when errors can't be detected without feedback. However, okay, let's take a look at this study here. In the study to the right there, one group got feedback after every trial, where one group there got only feedback half at the time. So we might expect there that performance and retention of the performance there would be better if we were given feedback after every trial. Okay. In each group there, both groups got the same number of trials, meaning that they practiced it the same number of times. Okay. So the 50% group also got less feedback overall, since they only got feedback half the time instead of all the time. So if we look at the results there, while the groups there, okay, were learning the particular skill in one session there, okay, their performance was the same, meaning that they improved at the same rate during their actual practice sessions there. However, when we looked at retention there, so retention meaning that after a delay there, okay, they were tested again to see how well they retained the particular skill that they learned there. This actually was better for the 50% group, okay, meaning that the group that got less feedback actually performed better in the long run, okay, compared to the group that got feedback after every trial. Okay. And what the authors presume there, the reason why the group that got less feedback actually improved better, is that by reducing the frequency of feedback, what this does is encourages the learner to make comparisons, okay, between how well they're doing in the blank trials and what they've done or what feedback they've gotten previously on some of those other trials there. And by making these comparisons, the athletes self-corrected themselves and essentially learned on their own there to try to do better on the other trials when they were not given actual feedback. Okay? And by doing this, by comparing their results in the blank trials to the feedback they've been previously given, okay, This might help them discover the better movement skills and qualities in the way they should be moving in this particular trials there to perform better. So essentially what this slide is giving evidence toward is that feedback after every trial might not be as beneficial as being given feedback after some trials. Another type of feedback we can use is faded feedback, meaning that early on, when a beginner is learning a particular new skill there, feedback is given almost 100% of the time. Okay? Now, as the person continues to practice and gets better, becomes more intermediate and more advanced there, okay, that means the feedback is given less and less often. So maybe at the very beginning, feedback is given 100% of the time. In the middle, for intermediates there, maybe it's given 50% of the time. Maybe for more advanced athletes there, feedback is given only 20% of the time. So with less feedback given as the skill improves, okay, that would be considered faded feedback. Now, another important point of faded feedback there is if performance drops there, we give feedback more often. So as long as performance is getting better, less and less feedback is given. Okay. However, if performance starts to decline, then we give more feedback so that we can get the athlete or student back on the right track. And the nice thing about this is this differentiates instruction, okay? Meaning that we give more or less feedback depending on where the athlete is in terms of their skill level. Okay. Now, also with this, another benefit of the faded feedback is that it allows for skill independence there, meaning that the athlete can learn there and become more self-dependent or dependent just on themselves instead of being dependent on someone else there, helping the person to self-learn instead of having to rely on someone else to give feedback. Another type of feedback is bandwidth feedback. Okay? And a good example of this is on this diagram here to the right. Okay? And it's called bandwidth feedback because we've got these different bands of different colors there, and they're a certain width in nature there. Okay? And what bandwidth feedback does is that it gives or it allows for a certain degree, a certain amount of acceptable performance. Okay? If the learner there, okay, if there was the result of their performance there falls within the specific band, okay, or bandwidth there, okay, they will only get qualitative knowledge results, such as correct or good. If the learners, if the knowledge or if the performance there falls outside the bandwidth, the instructor will give more specific knowledge of results there, giving more information about both the magnitude and direction of the error there. So for example here, okay, let's say we had a very narrow bandwidth of feedback there. So this, my apologies. Okay. So this very dark band here. So these trials here, where that falls within the band there, okay, this will be considered to be correct there, okay, and they would just give information, or the feedback given would just be, you did a good job, or that was correct. Now, if the trials fell outside this very dark salmon-colored band, okay, any of these trials here, we would give more specific knowledge results feedback. Instead of saying, for example, that was good or correct or good, we would say, no, that was wrong. You were 5 inches away from the target or something along those lines. Now, another important thing to note about bandwidth feedback is that it can be modified for different levels of error tolerance, okay? Meaning that the wider the bandwidth feedback is, the less total specific knowledge results are given, versus narrower, the more total specific knowledge results would be given. So maybe, for example, for athlete A, maybe you give a very narrow bandwidth of feedback, okay, this dark color. For athlete B there, okay, maybe they're given from +2 to -2. So this light salmon plus the dark salmon, that would be their entire bandwidth feedback. So why would we give more narrow bandwidth feedback or more wider bandwidth feedback. And that's due to the optimal amount of feedback that that particular student or athlete needs. Okay. Now, what this optimal bandwidth size would be, okay, has not really been established by research there. Okay. But what research does suggest, okay, where we might not be able to find the optimal amount, is that what research does suggest is learning is facilitated as bandwidth becomes wider. And that's due to less knowledge of results. So basically, if we use a wider bandwidth, so the light salmon plus the dark salmon color together, okay, so giving wider bandwidth versus very narrow, which would be just the dark salmon feedback, bandwidth feedback there, more learning would occur in the wider bandwidth compared with the more narrow bandwidth. Okay? And that's due to less knowledge of results. And here's the benefit for having a wider bandwidth of feedback. Number one there is it provides a natural way of fading in the frequency of feedback there. Okay, so with a narrow feedback initially, we give very specific information, and we'll probably give the feedback more often as the person is trying to learn. But as they become more advanced there, we'll use the salmon-colored feedback there, meaning that we give feedback less often. So again, as performance improves, error feedback decreases while motivating feedback increases. Okay. So withholding feedback on movements within the bandwidth leads to more stable or consistent actions there. Okay. Meaning that the learner is not encouraged to change action on every trial. So the wider the feedback, okay, we don't give them more feedback, meaning that their skills there will become more consistent. Okay. And kind of the age-old adage goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So maybe someone doesn't shoot the basketball with perfect technique, but if the ball continues to go through the hoop there, why do we need to correct that particular shot? Okay. If there's a good reason to correct it, maybe we do correct it, but as long as it's achieving what we're trying to do, the knowledge of results part, then maybe we don't need to give feedback and to correct it. Another method for giving feedback is the trials delay method. Okay, and this means that we're delivering feedback, but only delivering feedback after several other trials have been performed in that intervening interval. Okay. For example, there, let's say we give feedback is always given 3 trials after the particular movement has occurred. So maybe, for example, you shoot 1 free throw, okay, but the feedback is not given about your first free throw until you've shot 3 other free throws. Now, this might seem to prevent the learner from associating the movement with the corresponding feedback there. Okay. But in fact, there, it turns out this might not be really detrimental at all. Okay. In fact, okay, giving a delay on the feedback there appears to be more effective than giving feedback after every trial. So definitely want to make a note of this here. Okay. Giving feedback after or several trials down the line instead of after every trial there is more effective than giving feedback after every trial. Delay methods are thought to raise awareness of the inherent feedback that is available after performing the particular task. Summary feedback there is kind of would make sense based off of what it's called there. Okay, summary feedback is given after you've got several different trials in a row. Okay, and you're kind of essentially done with practicing for that particular skill or whatnot there. So after all the trials have been performed, then you give summary feedback or information about all those different trials. Okay. Now, not surprisingly, okay, this is detrimental to performance in practice, okay, as compared with immediate knowledge of results. Okay, meaning that if we give summary feedback, for example, let's say you had a basketball game, okay, and at the end of the basketball game, okay, when you get back in the locker room, the coach says, we made 50% of our shots. Okay, that would be considered a summary of feedback because we're given feedback there from the entire game, a summary of the game. So with summary feedback there, performance during the game was not as valuable there. Okay. Because if they were told how well they were shooting during the game, they probably would have made changes or skills there during the game there to get better. So during the game there, summary feedback is less effective than giving immediate knowledge or results feedback after every shot. Okay. However, though, summary feedback is effective for learning, meaning that, using our basketball example there, let's fast forward to the next game. Okay. If summary feedback was given for the first game, in the next game we would expect that shooting performance to be better because they have learned better from their previous game, compared to if they were giving information about their shot after every trial, okay, in the first game and then looking at their performance in the second game. So basically, learning is enhanced with summary feedback compared to feedback that is given after every trial. Now note here in this figure to the right here, okay, that it might not be that summary of knowledge of results is necessarily responsible for enhanced learning. Okay. If this was the case there, the both group, okay, in this particular graph here, okay, the line there with these square dots on it, okay, the both group would also be enhanced if this was actually the case. Okay. Rather, though, it appears that immediate knowledge of results is detrimental to learning, okay, meaning that we should not get knowledge of results immediately there to enhance learning. And that's because if knowledge of results is given immediately, there's too much information, meaning we're too reliable on feedback there, and we're not forced to undergo the information learning process ourselves there. Okay. So therefore, that's why summary of feedback might be more beneficial there. Okay. It's more so that immediate knowledge of results is detrimental to learning and less about the other stuff. So we need to optimize our summary length. So summary feedback is important, okay, depending on the size of the amount of trials that we undergo there that we have to try to summarize. Because we could go through too many trials and summary feedback there might not be as beneficial versus if we gave summary after a fewer number of trials. Okay. So, and studies have shown this there. There's an optimal number of trials that we can undergo there where summary feedback will be effective. Because too few trials, we become too dependent on the feedback being given. Versus too many trials there, okay, we lose on the benefits on error correction. Okay. And the optimal length before giving summary feedback depends on a combination of both learner experience and task complexity there. Okay. Please note here that in this diagram to the right there, it shows retention results that we're looking at. And what these results show that is experienced learners would benefit from having larger trial summaries, okay, in all conditions. So for experienced learners, whether you're performing a simple task or a complex task, you will learn these much better there if you have larger summaries. Versus for novices, okay, for simple tasks, okay, very simple tasks there, you will benefit from having larger summaries. Versus for complex tasks, it's better to have smaller summaries. So for example, a more complex skill, let's say, for example, doing a cartwheel. Okay, let's say doing a cartwheel for a 5-year-old there is a very complex task there. Okay. So it's better for if someone's first learning how to do a cartwheel, a complex task, to give feedback only or summary feedback there only after 2 to 4 trials compared to a simple task in novices. For example, let's say walking. So for a 5-year-old, walking is pretty simple there. And therefore, in that case there, giving summary feedback on walking there is better after many trials there in novices. So how does summary feedback work there? Okay. What summary feedback might do is that it might prevent the dependency producing effects, which we'll talk about later, of frequent feedback, because it causes the learner there to have to perform several trials there without getting feedback there. Therefore, they have to rely on themselves to make error corrections there and try to get better. Summary feedback there might produce more stable movements because that feedback is withheld for several trials there, okay? Meaning that the learner has no basis for change in the movement from trial to trial, meaning that their movements will be more stable and more consistent. Summary feedback appears there to encourage the learners to analyze their own movements there, okay, and therefore use information that they learn without having to rely on someone else there to detect their own errors. Another type of feedback is average feedback. And this is similar to summary feedback, but unlike summary, or what's a little bit more specific with average feedback, is that they receive an average score of what they got from all their trials, okay, rather than a trial-by-trial summary. Meaning that, for example, in the previous summary feedback that we were talking about, the learners there would get information about every single trial that they underwent. So for example, the coach might say, in trial 1, you were off by 5 inches. In trial 2, you were off by 3 inches. In trial 3, you were right on. Trial 4, you were off by 1 inch. Versus average feedback there takes a summary. Okay, so for example, the coach might say, to summarize your 10 trials, you on average there hit about, or were off the target there by 2 inches. Now, also like summary feedback with average feedback, okay, average feedback is much more effective for learning than getting feedback after every trial there. The optimal average feedback summary here, in this particular study there, the optimal size was 5 trial summaries, meaning that averaging the feedback after 5 trials there was better, or was the best there. Okay. In this particular experiment also though, but getting an average feedback after 15 trials was still better than getting feedback after every trial. Okay. Also to note there, the average feedback given was slightly better than summary feedback in this particular experiment. But the optimal average feedback summary length might just depend on the complexity of the task and the particular students or athletes that you are working with. So we talked about the frequency of the feedback we're given. Now let's talk about when to give the feedback, or feedback timing there. And we have established there in these last several slides there that giving feedback should not be given after every trial, meaning that we should not give feedback there after every attempt that the particular athlete or student makes there. But beyond that there, when should it be given? Should we be given feedback immediately after the trial is done, or should we give a delay before giving our feedback? As we talked about previously, concurrent feedback is delivered while the movement is going on. In order for concurrent feedback to be effective there must be sufficient time given during the movement for the feedback to be given there. Okay. Also, physical guidance will be classified as concurrent feedback. So again, this would be while the movement is occurring, giving feedback, that's concurrent feedback. Now the feedback delay interval, okay, this is the amount of time after the movement has completed until the feedback is presented. So maybe, for example, we do a vertical jump here. This will be in the red part, okay? And then, let's say we wait a few seconds, and then we give information about that vertical jump. So maybe after a few seconds there, okay, feedback's given, you jumped 20 inches there. Okay. Or maybe, let's say we waited 3 minutes after giving the vertical jump, and then they're told, hey, you jumped 20 inches there. So that's the feedback delay interval. From the time the movement stops till when the feedback is given, that's the feedback delay interval. And then finally, we have the post-feedback delay interval. This is the amount of time after the feedback is given, okay, until the next movement starts. So I do my vertical jump, I wait, I get my feedback, I jump 20 inches, and then I take a few seconds to reset myself before I do another vertical jump. So that would be the post-feedback delay interval. And so when we give our feedback is going to be important in the learning process. So concurrent feedback and guidance feedback. Okay. Concurrent feedback, as we discussed previously, can take on many forms there, such as giving verbal instructions, okay, getting some sort of visual guidance due to some sort of target there, whether it be a correct path, kinetics, or physical guidance there, actually moving someone through a particular range of motion there. Multiple studies have demonstrated that concurrent feedback and guidance feedback is great when we're trying to acquire the skill for that particular movement, meaning when we're first learning it during the first initial session there, but is very poor there for retention and for learning, meaning concurrent feedback and guidance are not good for learning in the long run. Physical guidance has several goals there, okay? Number one is to reduce or eliminate errors there. For example, someone using a Smith's machine to squat. Those of you who don't know, a Smith machine is a machine where you have a bar, but this bar is on a track there. You can put the bar on your back and squat up and down, okay? And this helps you to lift weights there, and it helps assist with the movement because you don't have to worry about balance because that particular bar there is on these tracks. Now with physical guidance there's also a measure of safety. So for example, if I'm spotting a back squat there, ready to catch or grab someone if they start to falter there, okay, it's great for safety perspective, okay, and it can help reduce or eliminate errors there. But again, it's very poor there for actually learning. So while I might use this here, okay, for safety reasons, concurrent and guidance feedback there, or eliminating errors there for very specific cases there, for most people there, it's not very good to use concurrent feedback and guidance feedback. Here's an example, a study showing that guidance is a poor teacher there. Okay. In this particular study by Armstrong, there were 3 groups. Okay. One group, okay, had physically restrictive guidance, okay, meaning that they were forcing correct movements there. Okay. Another group there had knowledge performance feedback concurrently, okay, of a visual kinematic trace, and then there was terminal knowledge or knowledge of performance feedback given. And throughout there was 3 days of practice there. Okay? And no surprise there, okay, that the guidance feedback showed the least errors, okay, followed by concurrent knowledge of performance feedback was the next best. So essentially on the left axis here was the amount of errors given there, or amount of errors done. And as you can see there, guidance feedback was the best, concurrent feedback was the next best, and then terminal knowledge of performance feedback was given. That was the worst, meaning they created the most errors. However, after a delay there, looking at the retention of the performance, essentially learning there, terminal KP performed the best, followed by concurrent knowledge performance, and then guidance feedback was the worst there in learning. So essentially, yes, your performance will be better while you're learning the task when it comes to guidance feedback or concurrent feedback, but terminal knowledge or performance there will be better for learning in the long run. Another type of feedback is error amplification, okay? Basically, it's physical guidance in reverse, okay? Meaning that instead of trying to get the person to move correctly, it uses device or skills or other variables there to try to force the person to perform worse, okay? The idea here is to generate explicit error correcting techniques there by the particular student or athletes. And we don't really have much studies on these right now there, but the early results of some studies suggest that error amplification, okay, there'll be better for learning there than some of our traditional methods that we use for this. So why don't concurrent feedback and guidance feedback work? Okay. Again, they are very good while we're actually performing the skill initially in our initial practice session there. But retention, though, performance falls to the level of, and sometimes below, that of learners who receive no guidance at all. And again, there are some exceptions to this. Okay? For example, someone who's wearing a life jacket while treading water, and that person there is scared of the water. And the reason why guidance feedback in this case of treading water there with a life jacket for someone who's scared of it is if someone's so fearful of the particular task there, that they don't want to do it at all, or they just freak out when they're in water when they don't have some sort of guidance feedback there. But providing that life jacket, it makes them feel safe there. In this case here, to help make someone feel safe there, that's when guidance feedback might actually be more beneficial, especially in terms of scary situations for people who would otherwise normally freak out or not undergo the task at all. So explanations on why concurrent feedback and guidance feedback don't work there is that if no errors occur while we are first trying the task out there, that means we don't get any experience correcting these errors. And because there's no errors, there's no decision-making process development while we're undergoing these trials there. And thirdly, the task is effectively changed when you have guidance work and concurrent feedback. So it's not very specific to what we'll see in the real world, where you might not always have that coach there to help you out after every trial. Or you might not have this particular machine that you'll be working on that forces you to move these movements specifically there. And therefore, in other tasks there, which require you to have to error correct, having concurrent feedback and guidance work will not be very effective in real world situations. So let's return here to these empty intervals. Remember, these empty trials or empty intervals there were when the trials where you were not given specific feedback. So let's look at empty feedback delay intervals. Scientists have expected to find that increasing the knowledge of results delay degrades learning. Meaning that the more time we give, before giving feedback there, we would expect that the results, that learning would be degraded. And we've seen this in animal studies. If we delay the reward too long there, this eliminates learning. For example, here, if you're trying to teach your dog how to sit, if you say sit and then you wait 5 hours before giving the dog a treat, the dog does not associate the treat there with sitting. Therefore, learning doesn't occur. However, if you say sit, the dog sits, and then you immediately give the dog a treat there, that would be a very short feedback delay interval, because you're giving it immediately after or within 1 second. So therefore, you would expect that learning would occur. We would also assume that that increasing the delay before we give knowledge of results there after the movement is completed there is we would expect that learning would be worse, because we know that memory, especially our short-term sensory store memory and even some short-term memory, information is lost rapidly there. So longer delays mean that we would forget about what we had learned there. So we would expect that learning would be degraded there if we have such a long delay from ending the movement and getting feedback. However, empty feedback delays, meaning that the trial ends and we don't do anything, and then we give knowledge of results there, this feedback actually shows no effects on learning. So studies have uniformly, meaning that have confirmed with themselves that they have failed to show that increasing the knowledge of results delay has any detrimental impact at all. So meaning that our delay from for finishing the trial there, the length of that delay, whether it's a few seconds, a few minutes, maybe a couple hours there, increasing the knowledge results delayed to a point there there doesn't seem to be any detrimental effect at all. However, okay, there is evidence that shows that there is a detrimental effect to learning if the knowledge or results delay is too short. Meaning that if the movement ends and we give the feedback right away, learning could actually be hindered if we give the information too quickly. So talk about giving information too quickly. Let's look at instantaneous feedback. Instantaneous meaning in an instant there. Okay. And so this is terminal feedback provided immediately upon completion. Okay. So it's not concurrent, it's immediately upon completing the activity. So given right away. Okay. However, what we found here is that instantaneous feedback has been shown to be on the level of impact there as concurrent feedback. If we look at this study here to the right here, okay, in this particular study, there was delayed and instantaneous knowledge results feedback was given. And in this case here, both delayed and instantaneous knowledge results had similar results on day 1 of practice there. Okay. But on day 2, and then in the retention tests and in day 2 tests and the retention tests, delayed knowledge results outperformed instantaneous knowledge results. And you can see that here. So on day 1 there, performance was roughly the same. But on day 2 and in the retention trials there, you can see that delayed knowledge results was much better than instantaneous knowledge results. Here's one possible explanation on why the delayed knowledge results was actually better. Instantaneous feedback blocks the learner from processing their inherent feedback, meaning that they didn't have time to actually think about, did I did well or not, and self-correct themselves. Instead, with the instantaneous knowledge results, they relied on that feedback instead of having to self-correct themselves because they were given it right away instead of having a delay and therefore having to self-correct without giving that feedback until later on. Now let's say our feedback delay intervals, okay, so this time from when the movement ends to when feedback is given, let's say instead of it being empty where nothing is done, let's say they are filled with some sort of activity or whatnot there. Okay. So what we showed in the previous slide, lengthening the feedback delay interval has no detrimental impact on learning, but that was when that interval was empty or where nothing else was done. But let's say that delay interval, okay, was filled with attention-demanding activities. So let's say you finished the activity, okay, and you had a minute before feedback was given. But instead of just sitting there before being given feedback, let's say you did something else during that particular time. Okay. Whether having this feedback delay interval filled with something else, how effective it is towards learning, depends on the nature of the task that we perform in that feedback delay interval. If in the first situation here, that delay is filled with the same task, there's no negative effect, and in fact, it actually enhances learning. So let's say you got done shooting free throws, and before you were given feedback a minute later, you continued to shoot free throws there. Okay. In this case here, okay, since the task was the same as the task that we're giving feedback on, learning would actually be enhanced. And that's because this is similar to summary feedback or trials delay feedback methods. Now, however, if the delay is filled with a different sort of task, learning is degraded. So for example, let's say I'm shooting free throws and I get done shooting free throws. I'm going to be given feedback on how my free throws went a minute later, but instead of just sitting there, I'm going to dribble a basketball for a minute. So by dribbling that basketball in that minute delay feedback period, okay, then being given feedback about my free throws, I would learn worse by dribbling, okay, compared to if I just would have sat there, or if I just would have sat there and then been given feedback about my free throws, or if I would have continued to shoot free throws and then given feedback. Okay. And this is why this leads to a degrade in learning is possibly due to the loss in the short-term memory before the arrival of our knowledge results feedback there. Okay? And this essentially affects the development of our error detection capabilities. Okay? Also, a reason this might be worse there is that inherent feedback and augmented feedback cannot then be compared to each other. Let's talk about subjective estimates. Okay? So what subjective estimates are is that the particular athlete or student guesses, okay, how well that they did there. Okay? So the support for the idea that is beneficial when the learner compares inherent feedback with knowledge results is provided in situations in which the learner is encouraged to make estimations during the feedback delay interval. So, for example, there we have the delay interval. Person just shot their free throws, and the person can guess as to how well they shot the ball there. Okay, and then they would be given feedback later on. Okay. Learners have performed more skillfully in retention, meaning learning there, if they made subjective estimates of their technique errors in performance. Okay. So basically, if you have your particular athletes or students estimate how well they did, and then after given that, they're given the actually knowledge results feedback there, this is going to be very effective for enhancing learning. Okay. In fact, here, if we have our students or athletes there estimate how well they did, okay, after every trial, okay, and then we give them actual feedback after every trial, this eliminates the detrimental learning effects of being given feedback after every trial. So meaning that if our students or athletes are actively trying to estimate how well they did after every trial, we could technically give them feedback after every trial, and we would be just as successful with learning as we would by using some other learning methods. However, though, if we estimate how well we did, okay, our learning effects will be diminished when we are not given augmented feedback there. Meaning, for example, if the person guesses how well they did, okay, but they are not actually given augmented feedback on top of that, their learning will be not as good. The benefit comes from having to be able to compare the two. Comparing how well we think we did with how well we actually did. We need to be able to compare those two to actually get better. Let's look at the post-feedback delay interval, meaning the interval from when we get feedback to when we start our next trial. This appears to be not very important there. Okay? Presumably, okay, the learner is actively processing their knowledge results to change the next movement, so shortening this interval should decrease learning. There is some support for this idea, but only when the interval is very short, less than 5 seconds. Okay? Overall, though, the evidence does not suggest that the length of this interval, meaning the interval from when we get feedback to when we start our next trial, it's not very important in the learning process. So let's look at feedback in terms of motivation there. Okay. So looking at motivation, how well it affects feedback. Okay. So let's first take a look at self-controlled feedback. There are studies where participants are presented with the option of receiving feedback or not receiving feedback after a particular movement task. Okay. And in this particular studies there, a control group is yoked to the self-control group, meaning that they perform the same number of trials, whether they get the feedback or not. Okay. The self-control group performed more effectively in both acquisition and retention there, meaning that the group that asked for feedback performed better while they were learning the particular task, as well as in the retention tasks later on. In multiple studies, participants generally So not all, but about 2/3 prefer to receive feedback after perceived positive trials. Meaning that people will more often want to get feedback after they think they've done well versus when they think they've done poorly. Let's take a look at now positive feedback. Okay. In one particular study, participants either received knowledge results about their best 3 trials out of 6 or about their worst 3 of 6 trials. Okay. In retention tasks, there, participants who had received knowledge of results after their best trials demonstrated more effective learning. Okay. Which does seem kind of odd there. Okay. Because we would expect with bandwidth feedback that the opposite would be true. Okay. So basically there, what this means here is that people who receive feedback about their best trials there will typically learn better than those who receive information about their worst trials. Okay. In addition there, as mentioned previously up top, those people who want feedback, basically more motivated to get feedback there, will learn better than those who do not want feedback. So study participants have shown better learning following feedback received at their requests there, particularly following good trials and when it reflects their best performance. Okay. And we might think why? Because wouldn't feedback be best there when it identifies the error? Okay. Here are 3 reasons why, though, that we might be more motivated to get feedback when we ask for it and when it happens, especially after positive trials. Number 1 there is it enhances learner autonomy. Okay. And we've seen this before when given choices in practice. Okay. Essentially, learners do better when they feel a sense of ownership. So by feeling like a sense of ownership that I get to decide when I want to get feedback there, okay, that makes me more motivated to learn there, and that essentially enhances learning. Number 2, okay, there's improved self-efficacy. Because if we receive feedback when we do things better, okay, we typically experience more confidence in our ability to perform that particular task, and therefore learning will be more enhanced. Okay. Motivation there has both indirect and direct benefits there. Okay. So the indirect benefit is that we're more willing to keep on practicing. So if we're seeing being successful, we're more likely to repeat that action because we feel good that we're doing well in that particular task. Okay. Also, there's also direct impact enhanced learning because the more we practice, the better we're going to do in general because we get more trials practicing a particular skill. And we've discussed previously in the semester that external attention results in more and better performance and learning than internal attention does. And the same has been shown also to be true in terms of feedback. Okay? Comparing knowledge of performance and knowledge of results again. Okay? So knowledge of performance again is about the nature of the movement or how we move, and therefore directs that learner to think about movement-related information, having an internal focus of attention. Knowledge of results provides information about the success of the movement relative to the environment and not how we actually moved in that environment. So therefore, knowledge of results will be more external focus of attention. And as knowledge of performance is often the preferred feedback there, instructors and coaches there, so therefore, I apologize. Okay. Knowledge of results there, again, is going to be more effective in learning than knowledge of performance is going to be due to the external versus internal focus of attention. But since often coaches and teachers will use knowledge of performance instead of knowledge of results in their feedback they give, okay, we might need to reevaluate how we teach and how we coach there to avoid an internal focus of attention in our students and athletes. Another important point to note here is that feedback can produce dependency on that particular feedback. Okay? And this is due to the guidance and hypothesis there, meaning that the learner, the student or athlete there, can be dependent on the source of the feedback there instead of developing their own skills within themselves there to self-learn and to self-correct their skills. Okay? And therefore, when this source of information is removed, such as the instructor giving feedback there, performance will tend to suffer. We know that too frequent or feedback given too immediately may blunt the process of inherent sources of feedback. Meaning we're not learning amongst ourselves there, we are learning and relying on the other sources of feedback. Okay. Feedback encourages corrections, okay, but motor performance is variable, meaning that we're not going to perform exactly the same on every single trial there. So knowledge of results is meant to change a small, or knowledge of results there, meant to change a small error may actually make the error larger on the next movement. Withholding some feedback to allow for stability can minimize this detrimental impact. For example, bandwidth feedback. That's all I got. If you have any questions, let me know. Have a good day. Booyah.